In this lecture, we'll shift the topic from human evolution to variation within modern human populations. In other words, rather than talking about what changes have occurred in the past, we'll talk about what conditions are here right now. Of course, since what is here now is the direct result of evolutionary processes in the past, we'll still be looking at past conditions somewhat. Describing the variation in human populations has always been of interest to people, and since physical differences are frequently immediately obvious, the use of physical differences to categorize different groups of people has always been popular. You can be sure that when Cro-Magnons first met Neanderthals, they considered one another different. These historical ways of classifying people were always ad hoc, however, lacking any rigorous rules. Historically, the first nominally scientific attempt to categorize and classify different kinds of people was made by Carolus Linnaeus in 1735. At the same time as he was classifying all other kinds of animals, he placed human beings in the same classification system, but for humans he did not stop at the species. To his credit, he recognized that all humans belonged to the same species, Homo sapiens. But within that species, he defined 4 varieties, what today we would call a subspecies: European, African, Asian, and American, by which he meant Native American. He based these categories on geographical origin, of course, but also the obvious physical differences found in each geographical region, things like skin color or eye shape. Another major contributor to the field of physical anthropology was Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, who wrote a generation or so after Linnaeus. Blumenbach spent a great deal of time studying not just superficial physical characteristics, but also very precisely measuring traits like skull shape and facial features. He defined 5 races: Caucasian, Mongolian, Malayan, Ethiopian, and American. Again, he meant Native American. Linnaeus, Blumenbach, and their contemporaries were engaged in developing the theory of anthropological racism, the scientific theory that the human species can be divided into distinct subspecies, often called races. Today, we know that this theory is false. There is only one extant human subspecies, Homo sapiens sapiens, that is, us. This was not true in the past, of course, when Neanderthals, Denisovans, modern humans, and several other subspecies did exist, but anthropological racism was a theory describing the modern population, not ones in the past. In the earliest days of physical anthropology, it seemed reasonable that humans could be subdivided in much the same way that many other animals could. The anthropological race scientists included more than just physical characteristics when they described the various human races. They also described each race as having a characteristic personality, cultural traits like religious beliefs or forms of governments, and so on. In fact, this view of human variability, that cultural and personal characteristics followed directly along with physical characteristics, remained popular among scholars until the 20th century. This is called biological determinism, the concept that phenomena, including various aspects of behavior, are governed by biological factors. Especially in the 19th century, the general scholarly idea was that certain races were intellectually incapable of certain kinds of cultural behaviors. And of course, the most capable race was the European or Caucasian race. While there are some dimensions of culture that have biological bases, that's what behavioral ecology is all about, after all, today, we recognize that the 18th and 19th century version of biological determinism is completely false. Culture is much more than the product of one's biology. We'll come back to why and how in a bit. When Darwin published The Origin of Species in 1859, it met a scholarly community that was steeped in biological determinism. When Darwin's followers popularized the notion that reproduction could spread favorable biological traits, and others believed that culture and civilization were the result of biology, it was only a short step to the idea of eugenics. the philosophy of race improvement through the forced sterilization of some groups and increased reproduction among others. The most intelligent and successful would be forced to interbreed, while those with undesirable qualities would be forced not to. Humanity would be improved by treating it, basically, like livestock. Darwin's own cousin, Francis Galton, first proposed the idea, and it spread among Western intellectuals quickly. It was especially popular among Americans, where eugenics-inspired laws remained in effect in some states until the 1970s. The problem with eugenics, of course, is twofold. First, biological determinism is wrong. No matter how closely you control breeding, you'll never produce a population without crime because crime isn't caused by genetics. And no matter how good his genes are, a child who's never taken a lesson won't be able to play the violin. But more problematic is this: who gets to decide which traits are favorable and which are not? The potential for abuse of genetics became patently obvious with Nazism and the Holocaust, when the so-called solution to the, quote, Jewish problem was just to kill them all off. Nazi eugenicists also killed off millions of homosexuals, mentally handicapped, and gypsies, all because of supposedly bad genes. Of course, by the time of World War II, many physical anthropologists outside of Germany had begun to give up on the idea of biological determinism and race anyway. As more and more evidence had been reported on how smoothly human populations graded into one another, the number of defined human races had proliferated. Some Nazi scientists defined upward of 30 races, for example. Also, scientists were increasingly aware of individuals and whole groups who seemed to violate the so-called rules of biological determinism. The mounting evidence that race simply did not work to describe human variation became more and more convincing, and after the world saw the horrors of the Holocaust, most scholars abandoned the ideas altogether. Today, no mainstream scientific physical anthropologist maintains the reality of human subspecies or races. So if physical anthropologists have abandoned the idea of human subspecies, what have they replaced it with? The word race is still extremely common in our society as it is in the scientific community. Strictly speaking, anthropological racism defines the race as more or less synonymous with the subspecies. The theory itself is completely value neutral. We don't accuse dog breeders of being bigots because they maintain that different breeds of dogs exist, and if human subspecies did exist, it would be no more bigoted to acknowledge their existence. Bigotry and prejudice enters when one assumes that certain subspecies are inherently superior to others without demonstrable evidence of the fact, and that evidence simply does not exist, so any such claim is automatically prejudiced. So races don't exist as biological subspecies, but there is still demonstrable variation among human populations. The technical term for a species with this level of variation is polytypic, many types. A polytypic species is one composed of populations that differ in the expression of one or more traits. There is variation within and among populations, but it isn't significant and regular enough to warrant a subspecies designation. In fact, types have fuzzy boundaries, and it may not always be clear which type an individual falls into. What's important for distinguishing the two cases, simple polytypy versus true race, is the degree of variation within and between groups. Race categories, if they existed, would be discrete. Individuals would belong to one and only one race, and it would be clear which. The statistical analyses are really complex, but basically, for a race to be a real grouping of human variation, members of the group would all have to be more similar to one another than the groups were to one another. That is, the two most different Africans would have to be more similar to one another than the average African was to the average Caucasian. And this would have to be true for all the characteristics that were supposed to separate the two groups. What anthropological racism predicts then is that people will cluster biologically. If you chart out various traits, say geographical origin versus skin color, with one dot per person, you'd see clear clusters of dots where one's phenotype on one axis clearly relates to a particular phenotype on the other axis. This is not actually the case, and in real human populations, the dots are one big amorphous blob. Race scientists would then try to draw circles around supposed clusters, but there would inevitably be overlap between the circles, or individuals who fell outside of any circle. Different scientists would draw different circles, and no one's solution would be better than anyone else's. This is because they were trying to describe a single large scatter of points as discrete clusters. They were trying to impose order where no order really existed. Furthermore, anthropological racism predicts that those clusters should be persistent with whole suites of co-varying traits, phenotypes which usually appear together. If a person's hair form places him in the African racial category, so should his skin color, his facial features, and his personality. That's not true either. In fact, there is no suite of phenotypic traits that uniformly separates out the so-called races from one another. Instead, human phenotypic traits vary according to Clines, a smooth gradation from one continuous phenotype to another, with no sharp breaks as one moves across geographical regions. On this photograph, where might you draw the line between the girls with light skin and those with dark skin? Any two girls standing next to one another have essentially the same skin color, so any line you did draw would be arbitrary. And again, different traits vary according to different clines. Skin tone follows one cline, height follows another, hair type a third, and so on. There's no correlation among the different traits that supposedly indicate a given race. None of this should come as any surprise if you think about the principles of heredity that we discussed at the beginning of the semester. All of the traits that have traditionally been used to define race are continuous, not discrete. Therefore, those traits are polygenic. Because individual genes are inherited independently, for the most part, and because all human populations interbreed with others, for the most part, there will obviously be a continual mixing and homogenizing of the human gene pool. If racial categories were to be discrete, as the theory of anthropological racism proposes, then we'd need to find Mendelian traits to define race. But Mendelian traits, by and large, aren't socially important. No one cares whether your earlobes are attached or detached, or whether you have dimples or not. The traits that influence our relationships and behaviors aren't discrete, so they can't be used to form important social groupings like race. Instead, we fool ourselves into thinking that continuous traits are discrete, because that allows us to form meaningful social categories that we call race. What does all this mean then? How can we talk about human variation at all? Well, we get much smaller and more specific. Race fails in part because it requires suites of co-varying traits. Modern physical anthropologists simply look at specific traits, one at a time, instead of whole sets. These traits that can vary from one person to another are called polymorphisms. Technically, a polymorphism is a genetic locus with more than one allele. If no polymorphism exists, then only one allele exists in the gene pool. Everyone will be homozygous, only one phenotype will appear, and there will be no variation. But introducing multiple alleles allows for different genotypes to form, and that produces variation in phenotypes. At this point, it might be helpful to step back and consider the three polys we've discussed today. First is a term we introduced earlier in the semester, polygenic, which refers to a genetic trait governed by more than one genetic locus. Some polygenic traits may also be polymorphisms, if those loci have more than one allele. Having more than one allele would create multiple different phenotypes for that trait. And if those different phenotypes were found in different populations, the species would be polytypic. On the other hand, polytypy and polymorphisms can also apply to Mendelian traits, and not all traits are polymorphic. It's important to keep in mind that these are three separate concepts. The remainder of this lecture will be a quick tour through some of the polymorphisms that physical anthropologists have identified, and an attempt to explain how and why those polymorphisms have arisen. I won't cover any of this in as much detail as the textbook, though, so be sure to carefully read those sections for the exam. The first examples expressed in the textbook are examples of biocultural evolution. Culture influences biological evolution, and vice versa. In the last unit, we spent most of our time looking at examples of how biological evolution had led to cultural change. Now we're going to look at the other side of the equation, an example where cultural traits have led to genetic changes among the population. This example of biocultural evolution is lactase persistence. All mammals are born with the ability to digest milk, specifically the sugar lactose, using an enzyme called lactase. But most mammals lose this ability as they mature, since milk is only given to nursing young. It would be an unnecessary burden on the animal to continue producing lactase when milk is no longer available. In fact, about 75% of adult humans worldwide are unable to digest fresh milk because they also lack the lactase enzyme. On the other hand, many other adults are perfectly happy to drink fresh milk because the genes that produce lactase are still active in them. Not surprisingly, the populations that have the highest rate of lactase persistence, and therefore the lowest rate of lactose intolerance, are those that have kept livestock for the longest. For those populations, milk is always available. If those populations became lactose intolerant as adults, they would be excluding themselves from a readily available, highly nutritious food source. Instead, the ready availability of milk has led to a gene for lactase persistence becoming widespread in their populations. Perhaps even more surprisingly, your book points out this has happened several times. The gene that allows adult Europeans to drink fresh milk is different from the genes that allow herders in sub-Saharan Africa to drink fresh milk, and those African genes are different from one another. This suggests that the trait has evolved separately in several populations because being able to drink milk is so beneficial to them. The remaining examples of variation that your book describes are not responses to the culture of the people, but to the environment in which they live. Some are adaptations in the strict sense, anatomical, physiological, or behavioral responses of organisms or populations to the environment resulting from evolutionary change. Others are acclimatization, physiological responses to changes in the environment that occur during an individual's lifetime. While the genome sets a range of possible physical states for the individual, which specific state he experiences within that range is a response to the environment. Some acclimatized responses are temporary and reversible, the result of moving into a new environment temporarily. But others are irreversible and lifelong, the result of exposure to an environmental challenge during growth and development. This process is called developmental acclimatization. Skin tone can be a genetic adaptation or a short-term acclimatized response. In the latter case, we call it a tan. But regardless of how a person's skin takes on its tone, either temporarily or permanently, it's generally agreed upon that darker skin is a response to higher UV exposure. Populations that have adapted to a tropical location, like sub-Saharan Africans or Australian Aborigines, have darker skin because the UV exposure in the tropics is much higher. Higher UV would cause skin cancer if pigment-bearing cells in the skin, melanocytes, did not absorb the UV first. So the more UV, the darker the skin, and whenever anyone is exposed to intense sunlight, their skin darkens in response. So why isn't everyone dark-skinned everywhere then? After all, you can never have too little skin cancer. Unfortunately, those melanocytes have a drawback. UV is necessary to produce vitamin D, which is important for bone growth. In places with little UV, like northern latitudes, too dark skin blocks vitamin D and causes developmental diseases like rickets in children. In those environments, the selective pressures for dark skin are absent, but new pressures for light skin are introduced. The consequence of this is that average skin tone for human populations, found in figure 12-6 in the textbook, that maps relatively well on the same map as average UV exposure, found in figure 12-10, at least in the Old World. New World populations haven't been in their current geographical locations long enough for significant adaptation to occur. Average temperature also has both adaptive and acclimatized effects on human populations. In anyone, exposure to heat will lead to sweating and vasodilation, both of which help the human body rid itself of heat more effectively. Exposure to cold will produce the opposite effects, shivering and vasoconstriction, both of which conserve body heat. These are temporary responses to temporary temperature changes. Evolutionary adaptations to long-term climatic conditions are seen primarily in body shape and size. The effects of climate on body shape and size are stated in Bergmann's and Allen's rules. In cold climates, short, stocky builds with shorter limbs, such as the build of this Inuit girl from northern Alaska, conserve heat. Meanwhile, in hot climates, tall, lanky builds with longer limbs dissipate heat, producing body shapes like that of this Zulu girl from South Africa. The basic principle at work here is surface area. Heat is lost from the skin, but generated by the whole body. To conserve heat, the surface area to volume ratio should be low, while a higher surface area to volume ratio will radiate heat. Finally, altitude is another environmental characteristic that has a big effect on human populations. All hominins evolved at low altitudes, but today, some human groups live at extremely high altitudes where the air is much thinner. This leads to a condition known as hypoxia, insufficient levels of oxygen in body tissues. When a person moves from low altitude to high altitude, because each breath has less usable oxygen, he or she must acclimatize to the new demands on his respiratory system. Temporary responses include breathing faster, and after a few days, the body will begin producing many more red blood cells to more efficiently gather and distribute the oxygen that is available. That's if a person moves to high altitude, though. If someone grows up there, he or she will undergo developmental acclimatization, producing lifelong changes. Such people mature more slowly, usually having smaller bodies in general to minimize the need for oxygen. Their lungs and heart grow comparatively larger, making the task of delivering oxygen easier, too. Some groups even seem to have undergone evolutionary change to adapt to high altitude. Tibetans seem to have several genetic adaptations to low oxygen environments because their ancestors have lived at such high elevations for as much as 25,000 years. The textbook finishes this chapter with a section on infectious diseases and their impact on human evolution. In the interest of time, I won't discuss that here, but be sure to know it for the exam.